Welcome to Legal Studies. Today we're going to be learning more about the Victorian Law Reform Commission. In particular, we're going to focus on a recent example of the VLRC implementing a project and making some recommendations. Where are we in the study design? Well, we've just finished learning about the role of the VLRC, and now we're down here looking at our recent example of that in action. So just a warning before we jump into it, this particular example is going to be covering issues that relate to sexual assault and violence, and I recognise that that might be confronting, and if that's the case, we have an alternative project you can look at on the OneNote. So our example project is the VLRC investigation into improving the response of our justice system to sexual offences. So in 2020, the VLRC was asked to review and report on Victoria's laws relating to sexual offences, including both adult and child sexual offences. And the review was asked to identify opportunities for improving how our justice system supports victims. It was asked to identify barriers for victims reporting sexual offences. And it was asked to make recommendations overall to improve our justice system's responsiveness to the needs of survivors. What did the VLRC do as part of its process? Well, it collected over 80 submissions, ranging from Victoria Police, from various doctors, from the Victorian Institute of Teaching, from the various courts, from Domestic Violence Australia, as well as several anonymous submissions from survivors of sexual offences. It pulled all of that information and resources together, as well as investigated on their own approaches in other countries, and made a series of recommendations, 7 major recommendations, along the lines of, well, first of all, that we should officially support restorative justice and other alternatives to the criminal trial, because we know that going to a criminal trial is really traumatic. So we should make it easier for survivors to get financial assistance and acknowledgement of what happened to them. The second recommendation should be that victims should not feel alone, and that they should receive more support, including the creation of what's called a victim's advocate, to walk the victim through their path in the justice system, provide counselling, emotional support, advice, etc. Someone to support them through the whole process. That we should establish at step 3 a commission for sexual safety to raise public awareness of this issue. The fourth recommendation was that a number of ways to make criminal trials themselves less traumatic on survivors, including judges and magistrates and barristers being provided with specialist training on how to support people, and a variety of other recommendations we can see here. So, for example, a stronger model for affirmative consent, and ways to make reporting sexual violence easier and less confronting for people. So these were our recommendations. They came in the form of a report, which was tabled in Parliament in 2021, in late 2021, and then a supplementary report on a particular type of offence called grab and drag offences was published in 2022. What was Parliament's response to this, to these recommendations? Well, in November of 2021, the government announced it was going to implement the recommendations, particularly the ones around affirmative consent, and there's already been moves towards putting that into law. And they also accepted the recommendations around criminalising stealthing, which is removing a condom without someone else's consent. And it's also said that it's going to consider all of the other recommendations. So overall, quite a successful law reform report, already some recommendations being accepted and others being considered. So how are you going to use this example? Well, you should use this example to support your arguments about your strengths and weaknesses of the VLRC. So if we're thinking about, one of the strengths of the VLRC is that, well, the government has asked them to do the report, so they're more likely to implement them. And we can see that here, where already they've gone ahead and implemented some of these recommendations. Another strength of the VLRC is that they can provide really comprehensive recommendations because they do really thorough research, and we can see that here with this really comprehensive list of all of these things that our government can change, and each of these, this is just a summary of them, each of these has further recommendations within them. So a real strength of the VLRC is how thorough they can be, and we see that here. A weakness is often that this process takes a lot of time, and again we see that here. They started in 2020, and they started early 2020, and it took them until the end of 2021. So roughly 2 years for this whole process. Sure, we're going to end up with some really solid, good, positive change, but it took us time. All right, and all through that time, more victims and more survivors were suffering through our criminal justice system. So you're going to use this example to support any strength or weakness you argue. All right, and that's it for our example VLRC project. See you next time.